was a little boy playing in his backyard, happily throwing a ball up in the air and catching it. A passerby, a little older than this little boy, was surprised to see such youthful delight, and he asked the boy what he was doing. He replied, "I'm playing a game of catch with God. I throw the ball up, and God throws it back." I can't comment on God's ability to play ball, but I do know that what goes up must come down, except maybe if it's Charlie Brown's kite, which goes up and gets caught in the tree. But as a rule, whatever goes up must come down. It's so predictable that it is a scientific law. The same process applies to our religious lives. It's a good thing to go up to a great experience with God, but we will become greatly disillusioned if we think, like Peter, that we can build a tent, build a house, build a building, and stay there, and forget that eventually we will have to come back down. Think about it for a moment. Many of us have had them, those times when we feel like we're on top of the world, really happy, confident. We know that we have all the answers, that we can solve any problem that comes along. Maybe we feel really close to God, really in tune with God's plan for us. In those moments, we were excited and alive. Everything seemed new and wonderful. That moment may have come at some exciting event in your life, a graduation, a baptism, first kiss, first day on a new job, your wedding, the birth of a child, the Patriots winning the Super Bowl last year, maybe even catching your very first fish. It might have been something really spiritual for you, like a week at church camp or a church retreat. Or it might have been something of a smaller, quieter nature, like a very intimate conversation with your parent when you felt that they finally, honestly understood what you were trying to say and why you felt the way that you did. In our lives, such times occur that are totally incomprehensible in the moment. We call these mountaintop experiences. And oh, how we hate to come down off that mountain. We want to hang on to that moment for as long as we can. Let's just stay right here. Let the rest of the world go on and do its thing. There are mountaintop experiences. There are also valley moments in our lives, and we are never ready for them. So when we have those mountaintop experiences, we want to hang on to them. We want to take time to analyze and understand them. They arrive unannounced, and they have the power to change us in irreversible ways. And so we want to put them on pause as we try to get control over what we can control in the moment. Like Peter. There's one thing these experiences all have in common. There's something that they have to say to us, something to teach us. In order to give ourselves the opportunity to learn what we can from that experience, the very best response that we can give is to be silent and listen and simply receive. In our gospel story today, we hear the writer of Mark give his version of this event, which is called the Transfiguration of Jesus. It's one of those rare moments of life which somehow defy adequate description, challenge us to stretch our concept of reality to the point that we may wind up asking the question, did this really happen, or did I imagine it? The three disciples had an amazing experience of epiphany. Jesus led them up on that high mountaintop apart by themselves, and there Jesus became transfigured, radiant, shining before them. Moses, representing the authority of the law, and Elijah, representing the authority of the prophets, stood with him there on the mountain. What an overwhelming experience. Scripture tells us that the disciples were terrified. How many of you would have been terrified? Yeah. What did they do? Peter did what Peter often does. He began babbling. He said to Jesus, "Teacher, what a great thing it is for us to be here. We'll get right to work making little houses for each one of you. We can just stay right here." Over the years, scholars have tried to explain what in the world Peter meant by this suggestion. But I think maybe it's pointless to try to figure out the meaning of those words. It's probably the way that Mark explains it. He was frightened. He just said the first thing that came to his mind, the way that Peter does. He simply could not comprehend what was happening, so he wanted to grab a hold of the moment. He wanted to get his control back. He wanted to get back to something that made sense to him. Too often, when we encounter the mysteriousness and the awesomeness of God, our response is like that of Peter, babbling absurdities, saying and thinking things that make no sense, things that are really totally distracting in the moment. We do it because we cannot understand the significance of that moment. In this case, when Peter does finally quit talking, when he lets go of the nonsense coming out of his mouth, a cloud appears and envelops them. And it's then that God's voice comes from the cloud saying, "This is my beloved Son. Listen to him." That's it. When we can let go of the babbling and the craziness in our hearts and our minds and simply be present and listen to the voice of God present to us. Short and to the point. Perhaps we won't hear the voice quite as clearly as Peter and James and John did that day. And perhaps it will take us a week or two or a month or a year to reflect and really hear what happened there. But there's always something for us to learn. I think it's significant that on this occasion, God spoke to them from a cloud. A cloud was a recognized medium for encountering God. Back in the early days of wandering in the wilderness, when the Israelites were led by Moses a couple of millennia before the birth of Jesus, God had guided the ancient Israelites by going before them in a cloud. The Jews always looked back to that time in the wilderness as the golden years, the halcyon age when God was very much present with God's people. So Peter, James, and John would certainly be aware of God's presence in a cloud. But maybe the cloud also describes how they felt about things at that time. Jesus had already begun to talk to them about his impending death and about the suffering that would be involved in his death, which must have made for unsettling and disturbing thoughts, challenging listening. The glorious revelation of Jesus as God at this event of the Transfiguration undoubtedly helped in some ways to counterbalance the fear and anxiety that was being generated as Jesus talked to them about his approaching death. For Jesus, this was a time of confirmation and affirmation of his ministry. For Peter and James and John, it was a brief glimpse of the transcendent, a peek at the reality that lies just beyond everyday life. Many of us muddle along in our lives in a bit of a cloud, not knowing exactly where we're going, not able to see the way ahead very clearly. We experience dark clouds from time to time. The clouds which gather over human lives are often dark and ominous and threatening, not white and fluffy and friendly. So it's worth remembering that no matter how glorious the Transfiguration experience, God did not speak at all during it, but spoke afterwards from the cloud which followed it and which overshadowed them. Out of the darkness of the cloud, God spoke to the disciples, and repeating the words used at Jesus' baptism, God told them who Jesus is. "This is my beloved Son." And he gave them one clear direction: listen to him. Good advice for us even today. When we're overshadowed by the clouds of life, it would be so nice for God to give us clear, detailed, specific directions. We may desire for God to tell us exactly what to do and how to do it. But if we're looking too hard for that, maybe we will fail to hear the quiet voice and the gentle message which simply says, listen. Listen. We're about to enter the season of Lent. This is a transfiguration time for us, too. It's a time to listen to God's voice for our lives. In the story of Peter and James and John, it may not have been immediately apparent, but those three ordinary disciples listened sufficiently to the voice of God in the cloud to enable their lives to be wholly transfigured after the resurrection of Jesus. Perhaps if we want our lives to be transformed, we need to listen to the voice of God when it comes to us out of the clouds of our lives. Much of the pain in this world is due to our unwillingness to listen and to obey. Elie Wiesel told the story of a prophet who came to a city and delivered his message every day in the marketplace. After a time, his ranting became a fixture of city life, and people regarded him with amusement when they regarded him at all. Finally, a small boy, pitying the old man, approached him and said, "Sir, why do you keep ranting and crying aloud like this every single day, year after year? The people here will never listen to you." "I gave up hope that they would listen to me a long time ago," said the prophet. "I go on crying lest I begin to listen to them." In the journey to Jerusalem, the disciples are given a genuine moment, a transparent happening that reveals with clarity that Christ, above all others, pleases God and above all others, speaks for God. It is this glimpse that will sustain their discipleship into the future. They, too, will come to moments when they find themselves crying out into a world not very eager to listen. But for those who listen, they will find a mountain of meaning. They will learn from heaven itself, "This is my Son, my beloved, whom I love." Let us listen. Amen.